So I thought I was doing the right thing by giving up my dreams to help my parents through their financial crisis. I had been saving for years to start my own engineering consultancy, but when they came to me desperate and crying about losing the house, I didn't hesitate. I handed over my entire life savings, 45,000 euros, thinking I was saving my family. But a few weeks later, I accidentally discovered something that made my blood run cold. While helping them organize paperwork, I found a bank statement showing they had withdrawn another 30,000 euros from a credit line I never knew existed. They had been lying to me about everything. So I'm David, 28M, engineer. I work at a mid-sized firm designing industrial systems, and honestly, it's not terrible, but it was never my endgame. I had always planned to go out on my own, maybe start a small consultancy, focusing on renewable energy projects. That was the dream anyway. I've always been the responsible one in my family. My parents, Maria and Carlos, are both in their late 50s and have never been great with money. They mean well, but they've made some questionable financial decisions over the years. My dad worked in construction until his back gave out 3 years ago, and my mom does part-time cleaning work. They've been struggling ever since Dad's injury, but I figured they were managing okay. I live in a small apartment about 20 minutes from their place, and I usually stop by every Sunday for dinner. We're close, or at least I thought we were. I've helped them out with small amounts here and there, a few €100 for repairs, utilities when things got tight, that sort of thing. Nothing major. The whole situation started about 2 months ago when they called me in a panic. They said they were about to lose the house, that the bank was threatening foreclosure, and they needed help immediately. I had been saving every spare euro for almost 5 years to start my business. It wasn't easy living on a tight budget, but I had managed to put away 45,000 euros. When they asked for help, I didn't even think twice about it. Family comes first, right? That's what I thought anyway. I remember that Sunday afternoon perfectly because it changed everything. I had gone over for our usual family dinner, expecting Mom's terrible but lovable attempt at paella and Dad complaining about whatever football match was on TV. Instead, I found both my parents sitting at the kitchen table looking like someone had died. Mom was crying, which immediately put me on edge because she's not really the crying type. She's always been the tough one who holds everything together. Dad looked defeated, staring down at a pile of papers spread across the table. The whole atmosphere felt heavy and wrong. Mom looked up when I walked in and told me they needed to talk to me about something serious. She explained that they had gotten behind on the mortgage payments after Dad's injury, and now the bank was threatening foreclosure. She said they had tried everything, talking to the bank, looking for payment plans, even considering selling the car. Nothing had worked. Dad finally spoke up and said they needed 45,000 euros to catch up on everything and avoid losing the house. He looked ashamed when he said it, like asking for help was physically painful for him. Mom started crying again and said she was sorry for putting this burden on me, but they didn't know where else to turn. I felt this sick feeling in my stomach because I knew exactly how much money I had saved, and it was almost exactly what they needed. It felt like some kind of cruel cosmic joke. Here I was, finally close to achieving my dream of starting my own business, and my parents needed that exact amount to save their home. But honestly, there wasn't really a choice to make. These were my parents, and they had sacrificed so much for me growing up. Dad had worked double shifts when I was in university to help with expenses. Mom had taken on extra cleaning jobs to pay for my engineering textbooks. How could I say no when they needed me? I told them I could help, and the relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. Mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and Dad actually teared up, which I had maybe seen twice in my entire life. They kept thanking me and promising they would pay me back as soon as they could get back on their feet. The next day, I went to the bank and transferred the entire 45,000 euros to their account. Watching my savings balance drop to almost nothing was harder than I had expected. 5 years of careful budgeting, skipping vacations, buying generic groceries, living in a tiny apartment, all of it gone in one transaction. But I felt good about it too, like I was finally able to give back to the people who had given me everything. I figured I was young enough to start saving again, and maybe in another few years I could still pursue the consultancy idea. The important thing was that my parents would keep their home. The next morning, I had to go to the bank anyway to get some paperwork sorted for a work project, and I figured I might as well check on the transfer to make sure everything had gone through properly. I'm pretty organized about financial stuff, so I always like to double-check these things. I went up to the teller and asked her to confirm that the transfer to my parents' account had been processed. She pulled up the information and confirmed it had gone through without any issues. Then she asked if I needed anything else, and I mentioned that I was curious about the current balance in their account, just to make sure they had enough to handle the mortgage situation. That's when things got weird. She looked at the screen for a moment and told me their account showed a much higher balance than I was expecting. I had transferred 45,000 euros, but she said their current balance was over 75,000 euros. I figured maybe there was some kind of mistake or delay in the system showing the right information. I asked her to double-check, thinking maybe she was looking at the wrong account. She confirmed the account details and told me that in addition to my transfer, there had been another large deposit of 30,000 euros just 2 days before mine. She said it looked like it came from a credit line associated with the same account. My stomach dropped. I asked her what she meant by a credit line, and she explained that my parents had a line of credit for 30,000 euros that they had accessed recently. This was news to me because during our conversation the day before, they had specifically said they had exhausted all their options and had nowhere else to turn for money. I tried to stay calm and asked if she could print out the recent transaction history for the account. She said she couldn't give me detailed information since I wasn't an account holder, but she could confirm the basic transaction amounts and dates. The 30,000 euro withdrawal had happened 3 days ago, which was the day before they called me in a panic about needing money. I left the bank feeling confused and honestly a little sick. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. Maybe they had tried to get the credit line, but it wasn't enough to cover everything they owed. Maybe there were other debts I didn't know about. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, but something felt really wrong about the timeline. They had called me on Sunday saying they had tried everything and were out of options, but they had accessed 30,000 euros from a credit line on Saturday. Why wouldn't they have mentioned that? Why would they say they had no other options when they clearly did? I decided to drive over to their house that afternoon to ask about it directly. I didn't want to accuse them of anything, but I needed to understand what was going on. When I got there, Mom was in the garden and seemed surprised to see me 2 days in a row. I told her I had been at the bank and noticed there was more money in their account than I expected. I asked about the credit line and whether that might help with their situation. Her face changed immediately, and she got this defensive look I had never seen before. She told me not to worry about their other financial arrangements and that the credit line wasn't enough to solve their problems. When I asked why she hadn't mentioned it before, she said it was complicated and that I wouldn't understand all the details of their situation. She seemed agitated and kept changing the subject. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation with Mom. Her reaction had been so strange and defensive. I kept trying to convince myself that there was some reasonable explanation, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I decided to do a little investigating on my own. I started by going to the local bank branch where my parents had their accounts. I couldn't access their information directly, but I figured I could at least understand more about how credit lines work and what the typical amounts and terms might be. The bank manager was helpful in explaining that a 30,000 euro credit line was actually quite substantial and would typically be enough to handle several months of mortgage payments for a house like my parents'. She also mentioned that credit lines usually have much better interest rates than personal loans, so it would make sense to use that money first before asking family for help. This made me even more confused about why my parents had presented the situation as so desperate. If they had access to 30,000 euros at a reasonable interest rate, why had they asked me for 45,000 euros instead of just using their credit line and maybe asking me for a smaller amount to cover the difference? I spent the next couple of days casually asking around town about my parents' situation. We live in a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business, so I figured someone might have heard something about their financial troubles or the foreclosure threat. What I found out was disturbing. I talked to our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lived next door to my parents for over 15 years. She told me she hadn't heard anything about foreclosure proceedings, which seemed odd because those things usually become neighborhood gossip pretty quickly. I also stopped by the local grocery store where Mom sometimes works part-time. The owner, Mr. Santos, mentioned that my parents had seemed to be doing better lately and had even talked about taking a small vacation soon. This definitely didn't match the desperate financial situation they had described to me. The breaking point came when I was helping them organize some paperwork later that week. Dad had asked me to help him sort through some old bills and documents, and while we were going through everything, I came across a letter from the bank that had been opened but then stuffed back in the envelope. The letter was about their credit line, and it mentioned that they had been approved for an increase from 20,000 euros to 30,000 euros. But the really shocking part was the date. The letter was from over 6 months ago. This meant they had access to this credit line long before their supposed financial crisis, and they had even gotten it increased recently. I tried to stay calm while we finished organizing the papers, but inside I was starting to feel really angry and betrayed. It was becoming clear that my parents had not been honest with me about their financial situation. They had access to 30,000 euros in credit, but they had still asked me for 45,000 euro while making it seem like they had no other options. When I got home that night, I sat down and tried to make sense of everything. The timeline didn't add up, the amounts didn't add up, and their behavior was getting more suspicious. I was starting to realize that I might have been manipulated into giving them money they didn't actually need for the reasons they had claimed. I decided I needed to confront my parents, but I wanted to be smart about it. Going in accusatory would just make them defensive, and I might not get the truth. So I planned to approach it more indirectly, maybe give them a chance to come clean on their own. I went over for Sunday dinner as usual, but this time I brought up the topic of their finances in what I hoped was a casual way. I mentioned that I had been thinking about their situation and wondering if there were other options we hadn't considered that might help them get back on their feet faster. I suggested that maybe they could look into a home equity line of credit or some other form of borrowing that might have better terms than whatever debts they were trying to pay off. I was basically giving them an opening to mention the credit line they already had. Dad looked uncomfortable and said they had already explored all those options. Mom jumped in and said that their credit wasn't good enough for those kinds of loans, which I knew was a lie because I had seen the letter about their credit line increase. I pushed a little harder and asked specifically about lines of credit, mentioning that I had heard they could be a good option for people in their situation. Mom got that same defensive look from a few days earlier and told me that I didn't need to worry about the details of their financial planning. The conversation was getting tense, so I backed off and changed the subject. But after dinner, while Mom was in the kitchen cleaning up, I told Dad I wanted to help them create a budget to make sure they could stay on top of their payments going forward. I offered to look through their bank statements and bills to help them organize everything. Dad seemed nervous about this idea and said they could handle their own budgeting. When I pressed and said I just wanted to make sure my money was being used effectively, he got defensive and told me that once I gave them the money, it was theirs to manage as they saw fit. That response really bothered me because it wasn't what we had discussed when I gave them the money. They had specifically said it was to catch up on mortgage payments and avoid foreclosure. Now Dad was acting like it was just a general gift with no strings attached. After I left their house, I decided I needed to get more concrete evidence of what was really going on. I remembered that my parents had given me access to their online banking a few years ago when Dad was in the hospital and needed help paying bills. I wasn't sure if that access was still active, but I figured it was worth checking. When I got home, I tried logging into their account using the old information. It worked, and what I saw made me feel sick. Not only could I see the 30,000 euro credit line withdrawal and my 45,000 euro transfer, but I could also see what they had been spending the money on. Instead of mortgage payments, I saw charges for new furniture, electronics, restaurant meals, and what looked like booking information for a cruise vacation. There were no large payments to the mortgage company or any other creditors. They had basically used my life savings and their credit line to fund a lifestyle upgrade. I printed out several months of bank statements and sat there staring at them for probably an hour. I felt like an idiot for trusting them so completely, but I also felt this deep sense of betrayal that was worse than just losing the money. These were my parents, people I had trusted completely, and they had lied to me and manipulated me in the most calculating way. I needed to talk to someone about what I had discovered, but I wasn't sure who to turn to. This wasn't the kind of situation I could discuss with just anyone, and I was worried about damaging my parents' reputation in our small community before I had all the facts straight. I decided to call my best friend Miguel, who I've known since college. He's always been good at giving practical advice, and I trusted him to keep this confidential while I figured out what to do next. When I told him the whole story, he was quiet for a long time before he responded. Miguel told me he was really sorry this had happened and that he could understand how betrayed I must be feeling. But he also said I needed to be prepared for the possibility that confronting my parents might not go the way I hoped. He warned me that people who are capable of this kind of deception often don't just admit their mistakes and apologize when caught. He suggested that I should document everything thoroughly before having any kind of confrontation. He said I should gather all the evidence I could find and maybe even consult with a lawyer about what my options might be. I hadn't even thought about the legal aspects, but Miguel pointed out that this could potentially be considered fraud. We met up that evening at his apartment, and I brought all the bank statements and documents I had collected. Miguel helped me organize everything chronologically and create a clear timeline of events. Seeing it all laid out like that made the deception even more obvious and deliberate. Miguel asked me what outcome I was hoping for. Did I want my money back? Did I want them to admit what they had done? Did I want to maintain a relationship with them? I realized I hadn't really thought about what I actually wanted beyond just getting some answers. I told him that honestly, I wasn't sure if I could ever trust my parents again after this. The money was important, but the betrayal felt worse. These were people who had raised me to value honesty and integrity, and they had thrown all of that away to manipulate me out of my life savings. Miguel suggested that I should confront them one more time, but this time with evidence and a clear plan for what I wanted to happen next. He offered to be there for support if I needed backup, which I really appreciated. He also suggested that I should be prepared for them to deny everything or try to turn it around on me somehow. We spent a couple of hours planning out how I would approach the conversation. Miguel helped me practice staying calm and focused on the facts rather than getting emotional. He reminded me that the goal wasn't to hurt them or get revenge, but to get the truth and figure out how to move forward. By the end of the evening, I felt more prepared and less alone in dealing with this situation. Having Miguel's support made me realize that I didn't have to handle this completely on my own. I also felt more confident that I was doing the right thing by demanding answers rather than just letting it slide. I decided I would give my parents one more chance to come clean voluntarily before showing them the evidence I had gathered. If they continued to lie, then I would lay out everything I had discovered and demand a full explanation. I went over to my parents' house that Saturday morning, telling them I wanted to have a serious conversation about their financial situation and my concerns about how my money was being used. I had all the documents with me, but I kept them in my car initially, hoping they would be honest without me having to produce evidence. We sat down in their living room, and I started by saying that I had been thinking a lot about their situation and that some things weren't adding up for me. I told them I was concerned that maybe they hadn't been completely straightforward about their financial needs and that I wanted to understand the full picture. Mom immediately got defensive and asked what I meant by that. She said they had been completely honest with me and that they were grateful for my help. Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything at first. I decided to be more direct. I told them I knew about the €30,000 credit line and that I had seen evidence they had accessed that money around the same time they asked me for help. I asked why they hadn't mentioned this other source of funding when they were explaining their desperate situation. The reaction was immediate and telling. Mom's face went red, and she started talking very quickly about how the credit line wasn't enough and how there were other debts I didn't know about. Dad jumped in and said that their financial situation was more complicated than I could understand and that they had done what they thought was best. I stayed calm and asked them to explain specifically what debts they had used my money to pay off. I said I just wanted to understand where the €45,000 had gone so I could feel confident that it had been used for its intended purpose. They looked at each other in a way that made it clear they were trying to figure out what to say. Mom finally said that they had used the money for various expenses related to keeping the house, but she couldn't provide specific details. Dad said that they didn't owe me a detailed accounting of how they spent money that was now theirs. That response made me angry because it was so different from what we had discussed when I gave them the money. I told them that I had given them my entire life savings based on their representation that it was needed to avoid foreclosure, and I thought I deserved to know if that was actually true. The conversation was getting heated, so I decided it was time to show them what I had discovered. I went out to my car and brought in the folder of bank statements and documents. When I put it on the coffee table, both of their faces changed completely. I opened the folder and showed them the bank statements that clearly showed the €30,000 credit line withdrawal, my €45,000 transfer, and then all the subsequent spending on non-essential items. I pointed out charges for furniture, electronics, restaurants, and travel bookings. Mom started crying and saying that I had no right to access their banking information. Dad got angry and accused me of spying on them and violating their privacy. But neither of them denied what the documents showed or tried to explain the spending. I told them that I felt betrayed and manipulated. I said that if they had wanted money for a vacation and new furniture, they should have just asked me directly instead of making up a story about foreclosure. At least then I could have made an informed decision about whether I wanted to help with those expenses. The conversation ended with them asking me to leave and saying that they were disappointed in me for not trusting them. They said they had raised me better than to spy on family members and that they were hurt by my accusations. No apology, no explanation, just anger at me for discovering their deception. After that confrontation went so badly, I realized I needed to involve other family members. My parents were clearly not going to admit what they had done or take responsibility for their actions. But I also knew that in our family, major conflicts don't stay private for long, and I wanted to make sure people heard the truth from me rather than whatever version my parents might tell. I called my Aunt Carmen, who is my dad's sister and has always been like a second mother to me. I explained the situation and asked if she would be willing to help mediate a family meeting where we could discuss everything openly. Carmen was shocked by what I told her, but she agreed that it needed to be addressed. Carmen arranged for a meeting at her house the following Sunday, with my parents, my uncle Roberto, and my cousin Lisa also attending. She told my parents that I had some concerns about the money I had lent them and that we needed to have a family discussion to clear the air. When we all gathered at Carmen's house, the atmosphere was tense from the beginning. My parents looked defensive and angry, while the other family members seemed confused about why we were there. Carmen started by explaining that there seemed to be some disagreement about the circumstances around the money I had given my parents. I had prepared a clear presentation of the facts, with copies of all the relevant documents for everyone to see. I started by explaining how my parents had approached me about needing 45,000 euros to avoid foreclosure and how I had given them my entire life savings to help. Then I showed everyone the bank statements that revealed the 30,000 euro credit line withdrawal that happened just before they asked me for money. I explained how this contradicted their claim that they had exhausted all other options and were facing immediate foreclosure. My parents immediately went on the attack. Mom started crying and saying that I was trying to humiliate them in front of the family. Dad accused me of being ungrateful and selfish, saying that they had sacrificed everything for me when I was growing up and that I owed them more than just money. But the other family members were looking at the documents and asking pointed questions. Uncle Roberto asked my parents directly why they hadn't mentioned the credit line when asking for help. Cousin Lisa wanted to know if there was actually a foreclosure threat or if that had been made up. My parents couldn't give straight answers to these questions. They kept deflecting and trying to make the conversation about my supposed betrayal of family trust rather than addressing the evidence of their deception. The turning point came when Carmen asked to see the bank statements showing how the money had been spent. When she saw the charges for furniture, electronics, and travel, her expression changed completely. She looked at my parents and asked them directly if they had used David's money for a vacation instead of saving their house. Mom broke down completely at that point and admitted that yes, they had used some of the money for other things, but she claimed they deserved it after all the stress they had been under. Dad tried to justify it by saying that they had worked hard their whole lives and deserved to enjoy themselves. The room went completely silent. Uncle Roberto looked disgusted, and Carmen told my parents that she was ashamed of them. Lisa said she couldn't believe they had lied to the whole family about their situation. My parents realized they had lost the room and tried one last desperate move. They said that I was being cruel and vindictive, that family should stick together no matter what, and that I was destroying our relationships over money. They tried to guilt-trip everyone by talking about all the sacrifices they had made as parents. But it was too late. The evidence was clear, and the other family members could see exactly what had happened. Carmen told my parents that they needed to figure out how to make this right with me, and that the family would not support them in trying to avoid responsibility for their actions. The family meeting had been both vindicating and exhausting. It felt good to have other people see the truth and support me, but it also made the whole situation feel more real and final. There was no going back to the way things were before, and I had to figure out how to move forward. Over the next few weeks, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to happen next. My parents made no effort to contact me or apologize after the family meeting. According to Carmen, they were telling people that I had blown everything out of proportion and that they were the real victims in the situation. I consulted with a lawyer about my options for recovering the money. She explained that I could potentially file a civil lawsuit for fraud, but it would be expensive, time-consuming, and there was no guarantee I would recover anything even if I won. She also warned me that suing my own parents would probably destroy any chance of repairing our relationship in the future. The lawyer suggested that I should first try to work out some kind of repayment plan through mediation or family negotiation. She said that many family financial disputes could be resolved without going to court if both parties were willing to compromise. But when Carmen approached my parents about the possibility of setting up a repayment plan, they refused to discuss it. They maintained that the money had been a gift, not a loan, despite all the evidence showing they had misrepresented their situation to get it. I realized that my parents were not going to take responsibility for what they had done or make any effort to make things right. They were more concerned with avoiding consequences than with repairing our relationship or acknowledging the harm they had caused. This was probably the hardest part of the whole experience, accepting that my parents were not the people I had thought they were. I had always seen them as honest, hardworking people who had strong moral values. Discovering that they were capable of such calculated deception and manipulation was devastating. I talked to Miguel and Carmen extensively during this period, trying to figure out how to process everything that had happened. They both supported whatever decision I made about how to handle the situation going forward. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that I needed to accept the loss of the money and focus on protecting myself emotionally. Continuing to fight for repayment would just keep me tied to people who had proven they couldn't be trusted, and it would prevent me from moving on with my life. I decided to cut off contact with my parents completely. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I realized that maintaining a relationship with people who had manipulated and betrayed me so thoroughly would be unhealthy for me in the long run. I wrote them a letter explaining my decision and making it clear that I considered our relationship over unless they were willing to acknowledge what they had done and make genuine efforts to repair the damage. I never received a response to that letter. It's been about 8 months since I cut contact with my parents, and I'm honestly doing better than I expected. The first few months were really hard, especially during holidays and family events, but I've started to build a new normal for myself. I ended up leaving my old job and taking a position with a different engineering firm that offered better opportunities for advancement. I couldn't start my own consultancy without my savings, but this new job has been challenging and rewarding in ways my old position wasn't. I've also been rebuilding my savings, though obviously it's going to take time to get back to where I was. I'm being more careful about my financial planning now, and I've learned to be more skeptical when people, even family members, ask for help with money. The hardest part has been dealing with other family members who think I should forgive my parents and try to repair the relationship. Some people seem to think that family loyalty should trump everything else, even when family members behave badly. Carmen and Miguel have been incredibly supportive throughout this whole process. Carmen in particular has helped me understand that choosing to protect myself doesn't make me a bad son or a bad person. She's also kept me informed about how my parents are doing without pressuring me to reconcile. Apparently, my parents are still telling people that I overreacted and that they're the victims in this situation. They've never acknowledged that they did anything wrong, which confirms that I made the right decision in cutting contact. I've started seeing a therapist to help process the betrayal and loss of trust. It's been helpful to have a neutral person to talk through everything with, and she's helped me understand that what my parents did was a form of emotional and financial abuse. The therapy has also helped me recognize some patterns in my relationship with my parents that I hadn't seen before. I think I had been conditioned to always put their needs first and to feel guilty for having boundaries or expectations in our relationship. I've started dating someone new, and it's been interesting to navigate that relationship with everything I've learned about trust and boundaries. I'm more cautious now, but I think that's probably healthy rather than being a problem. Overall, I feel like I've grown a lot from this experience, even though it was incredibly painful. I've learned that I can survive losing people who are important to me, and that sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the healthiest choice you can make. Epilogue. Looking back now, I can see that cutting ties with my parents was one of the hardest but most necessary decisions I've ever made. I still have moments where I miss them or wonder if I should have handled things differently, but I know I made the right choice for my mental health and future. I've learned to be more careful about who I trust with my resources and my emotional well-being. The experience taught me that even people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can sometimes prioritize their own wants over your needs and well-being. My relationship with the rest of my family has actually gotten stronger since this happened. Carmen and I are closer than ever, and my cousins have been incredibly supportive. I think seeing how my parents behaved helped everyone understand what real family loyalty looks like. I'm still working on rebuilding my savings for the consultancy, but I'm more motivated than ever to achieve that goal. In some ways, this whole experience has made me more determined to create the independent, successful life I've always wanted. If I had to give advice to someone in a similar situation, I'd say trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, even if it involves people you love. Don't let guilt or family pressure prevent you from protecting yourself from people who would take advantage of you.